It all began with the dream of a peaceful life in the French countryside. My parents had found what they described as a hidden gem, an old 19th century mansion in a tiny village, about an hour south of Paris. It was in Burgundy, surrounded by sprawling vineyards and cheese factories. The village itself had fewer than 50 residents, a charming bakery with the best croissants I'd ever tasted, a pub, a butcher shop, and a quaint little church right in the center of it all. The price of the mansion was absurdly low, which should have been our first warning sign. But my parents, entranced by the romance of rural France, brushed off any doubts. When we first arrived, the villagers greeted us warmly, maybe a little too warmly. Everyone smiled and nodded, saying bonjour as they passed us on the cobblestone streets. It felt like stepping into a postcard, but there was something off about it. The way they smiled felt forced, like they were trying too hard. We were outsiders, and we felt it. But they seemed to be making an effort to welcome us, so we tried to settle in. One afternoon, driven by curiosity, I decided to explore the area. Just outside the village, I stumbled across an abandoned farm. Its weathered wooden beams and overgrown fields gave it an eerie charm. As I wandered closer, I noticed a heavy iron door built into the ground near the barn. It was locked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to stay that way. Shrugging it off, I returned home. But something about that door lingered in the back of my mind. A few nights later, I found myself restless. Unable to sleep, I decided to take a walk. The village was deathly silent at night, but as I passed by the abandoned farm, I saw a faint light flickering from within. My stomach tightened as I crept closer. That's when I heard it, singing, or at least something that sounded like singing. It wasn't in French, it wasn't in any language I recognized. It was guttural, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling. My skin crawled. I turned and hurried home, heart pounding in my chest. The memory of that night haunted me. A few days passed, and again I found myself drawn outside after dark. This time I resolved to investigate. The light was there again, flickering from the windows of the abandoned farmhouse. The singing was louder now, and it sent shivers down my spine. Steeling myself, I crept closer and peered inside. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Inside the barn, the heavy iron door was open, revealing a chamber below. The priest from the village church stood at the center of a group of people, speaking that same strange language. On a makeshift altar, he was cutting into what I thought was an animal, until I saw the hands. It wasn't an animal. The villagers surrounded him, some wearing pristine white robes, others splattered with blood. I recognized the butcher. I recognized our neighbors. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to stay hidden. I listened closely, heart thundering in my chest. "We will offer the newcomers to the sacred man," the priest said in that guttural chant. "They must feel welcome until the day of the offering." I froze. They were talking about us. I knew my parents wouldn't believe me without proof. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and started recording. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. And then, the worst thing happened. My phone rang. Every head in the barn snapped toward me. For a split second I was paralyzed with fear. Then I ran. Shouts erupted behind me as I sprinted back toward the village. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, footsteps pounding the ground, gaining on me. My lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I reached our mansion and slammed the gate shut behind me, fumbling with the lock. Just as I secured it, I saw 3 figures emerge from the darkness, their faces twisted with fury. They stopped at the gate, glaring at me, but didn't try to climb over. "Leave!" one of them hissed. "Before it's too late." I burst into the house, waking my parents. Through gasping breaths, I explained everything, shoving my phone into their hands to show them the video. My mom screamed. My dad turned pale. By morning, we had packed our things and loaded the car. We didn't tell anyone we were leaving. We didn't say goodbye. As we drove away, I saw the villagers standing in the square, watching us, smiling. But this time, their smiles weren't forced. They were triumphant. We didn't stop driving until we reached our old house. My parents didn't sell it before moving, and thank God for that. I don't think any of us will ever step foot in that village again. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that iron door, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run fast enough. It was supposed to be perfect, our first home, a cozy, modest house in the middle of the Swedish countryside. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything we needed. Space for a garden, a spare room we could one day turn into a nursery, and peace and quiet. After years of saving, countless visits to the bank, and finally signing the paperwork, the house was ours. My girlfriend and I were thrilled. We both worked remotely, so the isolation wasn't a problem. In fact, it was part of the appeal. No noisy neighbors, no city chaos, just us and the vast open fields. But things started to change quickly. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was half asleep. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate steps echoed from the living room downstairs. The house was old, and the wooden floors creaked under any weight. I shot up in bed, heart racing, convinced someone had broken in. I didn't want to alarm my girlfriend, so I silently grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and crept down the stairs. The living room was empty. Nothing was out of place, and every door and window was securely locked. I even checked twice. Feeling foolish, I chalked it up to the quirks of an old house and went back to bed. A few nights later, the same thing happened. This time, my girlfriend heard it too. She nudged me awake, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. The footsteps were unmistakable now, pacing the length of the living room. Together, we crept downstairs, but like before, there was nothing. Except this time, the rocking chair in the corner, a piece of furniture that came with the house, was gently rocking back and forth. Neither of us touched it. We didn't believe in the paranormal. I was the type of person who needed logical explanations for everything, but I had none. Maybe the floor was warping, or the wind had somehow shifted the chair. But how did that explain the footsteps? Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to sleep in the living room the next night. My girlfriend wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I wanted answers. I set up camp on the sofa, armed with my phone and the flashlight. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I stared at the rocking chair, daring it to move, but it stayed still. I told myself it was all in our heads. But around 3 a.m., the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like something unseen was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. Then I heard it. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the glow of the lamp. They weren't coming from upstairs or outside. They were in the room with me. I gripped the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty space in front of the rocking chair. But it wasn't empty. A figure, tall, shadowy, and vaguely human, stood motionless in the corner of the room. Its shape was distorted, like a smudge of darkness that didn't belong in the light. It had no face, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. The rocking chair began to move, creaking back and forth, with a slow, rhythmic groan. I froze, unable to breathe. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was bending. Then, in a voice that didn't sound entirely human, it spoke. "Leave!" The words snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted upstairs, yelling for my girlfriend. She didn't ask questions, she grabbed her coat, and we fled the house that night. We spent the next few days in a small motel nearby, trying to make sense of what had happened. My girlfriend wanted to sell the house immediately, but I wasn't ready to give up. I contacted the previous owners, desperate for answers. That's when I learned the truth. The house had belonged to a family decades ago, but they had left under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled in the village. A child had gone missing, and the rocking chair, they said, had belonged to him. Some claimed they could still hear him pacing the floors at night, searching for something or someone. Against my girlfriend's protests, I returned to the house one last time, determined to face whatever was there. Armed with a camera, I set it up to record the living room while I waited upstairs. At 3 a.m., the footsteps began again. Then the rocking chair moved. I stayed rooted to the spot, terrified, but refusing to run. The last thing I remember is a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't have stayed." I woke up hours later, sprawled on the floor of the living room, with no memory of what happened after that voice. The camera footage, it was gone. The SD card missing. We sold the house at a loss and moved far away. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the creak of footsteps on wooden floors. And when I do, I think about that rocking chair. and wonder if it's still moving.